Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Thompson. I am the Vice-Chancellor here at the RCA. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this talk with Ian Griffiths, interviewed by Zowie Broach, the wonderful head of fashion here at the RCA. Ian, I can't quite believe that the last time we spoke, you were holed up in Suffolk with designing that extraordinary collection, 1951. And here it is, or there it was now, captured in that fantastic video celebrating the 70th anniversary of Max Mara. You said it was going to be in Milan very modestly. Actually, it's sumptuous and unbelievably ambitious and an extraordinary collection. And I'm sure everybody will agree it does great justice to the wonderful label and fashion house that is Max Mara.
Thank you.
Ian, you have the shortest CV in fashion history, of course, because you left the RCA as a graduate, having won a competition to design a project for Max Mara in 1987, and really the rest is history. You've been with the company as Chief Creative Director and have led it and really defined so much of its style and obviously contributed to its success over many years. But if we kind of rewind to the pre-RCA days, I'm told that there was quite a lot of kind of punk energy in your Mancunian or your Manchester days studying architecture at Manchester University. And one of the notes that I read about you was that Manchester and architecture really sort of taught you about raw energy and creativity. But it was the RCA that taught you how to channel that energy into making something useful, and it's where you developed your commitment to good design, which I think is a lovely segue from architecture through to fashion and the RCA and on to Max Mara. One of the things I also read was that. You're very interested and the sort of the muses and the inspiration you draw range quite widely, actually, from the Bauhaus and Beethoven, I guess two sort of good Weimar figures there, through to sort of Dostoevsky and David Bowie. And there was obviously, I could pick up the Beethoven bit very clearly in that fashion reel. And I think also the references to the royal family and the royal family in August in Balmoral, definitely that kind of headscarf at the end. Yes, it brought back memories of seeing the latest episode of The Crown. It's wonderful references there. I'm going to stop gabbling. I'm just going to say thank you very much indeed. I'm going to hand you over to a much more expert pair of hands in the shape of Zowie Broach, who I know is going to really enjoy asking you a number of questions about your career, and then introduce you to some of the students and in fact a very distinguished alumni who is joining us today also to pose a question to you. So thank you very much, Ian, and it's lovely to know that you are now no longer in Suffolk, but back at work in Italy.
Thank you, Paul. Hey Ian, how are you?
I'm very well. I'm very honoured to be with you this evening.
Yeah, no, it's really great to have you. How I want to start is we have some images that are going to go on a loop throughout our session. And in kind of looking at all these images that you beautifully put together and kind of understanding more about you as I researched, it seemed to me you hovered a little bit between kind of Ian Curtis and Noel Coward with a kind of little bit of David Bowie on your shoulder, always on your shoulders. And I love the fact that you have kind of Susie Sue, and then you have Nancy Pelosi, and then you have Lee Miller and Blondie, and of course, you know, amazingly, Max Mara was on the shoulders of Kamala Harris. But and then there was a great quote. There's a radical agenda under every camel coat, I think you'd said. But I think again, a little bit like what Paul is saying, these kind of phenomenal spread of inspirations. I just wonder whether you just talk through a little bit, just to kind of give us not so much about Max Mara, but the way you think and the way that these have been kind of so seminal for you.
Yes, I really enjoyed putting these images together with you, Zoe, and making a selection from the thousands and thousands of images that we've used over the past few years, some of them recurrently, as inspiration. And the whole point about inspiration, when you look at a thing like Max Mara, which has such a strong identity, is that it can be an influence, and an influence can be used as heavily or as subtly as you like. And all those things you've talked about in my past obviously come through in what I do as a designer. And so I constantly refer back to moments from my own past, from those pre-RCA days, the Manchester days, the punk days, the post-punk days, and that all gets fed into the mix. And you're right, that's how we've arrived at this idea that underneath the camel coat, there's a woman with a radical agenda, and that how do you dress if you want to change the world? You wear classics.
Or a radical dog, even.
Or a radical dog. That's William Wegman.
I know, it's amazing.
Wearing Max Mara.
Yeah, it's so interesting though, because I think I love another thing you said, that collaborations are oxygen. And when I look at a lot of these images, it's not just that they feel like they're like a part of inspiration. There's these interesting sort of subconscious kind of lines that echo, if that makes sense. They're like traces.
I always look for reflections and echoes, and I always look for the reverse side of things. So one of the images on, I don't know if it's appeared yet. Here it is, Marilyn and Tolstoy. I did a whole collection that was inspired by the idea that Marilyn, when she died, left a library of hundreds and hundreds of books, including Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. And it was about the fact that Max Mara is seen as intelligent clothes, not necessarily sexy, and Marilyn was seen as a sexy woman, not necessarily intelligent. And I wanted to look at the corollary of both those concepts. And so I was also fascinated by the idea it's NN, Marilyn Monroe, Max Mara.
Yeah.
And so that's how that collection was born. And then later on, there's an image of Susie with Marilyn, and another collection that I did was inspired by a personality that we invented, where we fused Marilyn and Susie and explored how Marilyn was during the 1970s and 80s a kind of punk icon. So that was Susie Monroe. I always like to look at the other side of something and explore the unexplored side of it.
I love the one of you look a little bit Donnie Darko earlier. I think also what was interesting is understanding that you talked about that your early years of Max Mara were kind of surrounded by the artworks that have been collected by Achille Maramotti, the founder of Max Mara. And it seemed like a kind of a wonderful exchange, that there's all this artwork that was being collected, that while you're designing, that this is being put up on walls around you.
Yes, I was fortunate to live with art, not just me, but everyone who worked in the company. And I think that the founder, Achille Maramotti, wanted to challenge everyone who and stimulate everyone who worked for him, from the creative team to the commercial people to the ladies who work in the sewing room, with contemporary art to stimulate them, to provoke them, to challenge them. So as he was assembling what's now the Collezioni Maramotti, he was hanging things in the corridors. So I grew up with the Cunellis and the Fontanas and the Burris, and some of Anselmo here, the torch, the anchor, was one of my favorite pieces. And in fact, here's the Fontana. Those pieces are kind of, they don't belong to me, but they help me to understand that you don't have to own a piece of art for it to have a real meaning for you. And in fact, there's one piece on here that I always say is my, if you like, favorite, a Richmond Burton piece that for me has such significance and really talks to me about the creative process in a way that nothing else can. That painting is a real part of my life.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, just such a sort of beautiful generosity of kind of this subtle learning that's sort of forming the values of a company. And And, you know, what I think is really amazing is it's still family owned. And I feel like today it's really important to understand there are still this potential that it doesn't have to get caught in this kind of corporate side, this kind of sense of what that means as a company.
Yes, and what you say gives a real flavour of how it feels to work in this company. It feels like we're a small company because we're a small group of people here in Reggio Emilia interacting with each other on a very familial basis. And so the people I work with in my team are in a way like a family. We can, an Italian family means we can even argue without serious consequences. And because of the fact, I think the fact that the company is family owned, it has a real family feeling. And that's why people work here for most of their working lives. My studio director has been with me for over 30 years, and my design director, who's from the UK, Abdul, has been with me since the year 2000. So the company is based on the idea of longevity, people knowing each other, and in investing their futures in the company.
So, okay, we're gonna have to go to the image that's on the RCA site. We're gonna take you right back to a different community, those early days of Manchester. I mean, it's such a fantastic image. So I'd like to kind of pull it right back for a minute and just that time in Manchester, like the feeling of night compared to day, the scent, the smell, the places.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of smell, and most of the days were spent waiting for the nights. It was nightlife. I mean, I arrived in Manchester because I went to study architecture at Manchester University, and of course, the nightlife won, and I dropped out. So I ended up being a club kid for several years, and at a time when Manchester was a really happening place. It was the years of Joy Division and eventually the Hacienda, and a lot of these photographs were of me in those days were taken then. You know, what do I remember about it? I mean, you said the smells, like patchouli oil and stage makeup and sweat and smoke.
Do you make all your clothes at that point? There's like a fantastic one with you in a sort of like a new romantic kind of medieval shoulder pad look.
Oh yes, I mean you made your own clothes. I mean, I'd spend an afternoon, an hour and a half making an outfit, and then I'd spend 5 hours doing the makeup to go with it. Everything was made for instant effect, and nothing was finished up on the inside or lined or anything. It was only made to be worn for 1 or 2 evenings. But it was all. I was thinking about those days. You know, what were those days about? We were living in an indescribably run-down council estate, which is now being demolished near the centre of Manchester, called Hume, in flats that the council was too embarrassed to even claim rent for. We lived in the most miserable conditions, and most people on what was then known as supplementary benefit. I mean, poverty. You know, and we lived on a diet of cornflakes and crisps. But we lived for that moment when you'd go to a club, and it was all about your image.
And is that when you lived next door to Ian Brown, that I only just found out about?
Yeah, I mean, it was a moment, and when things were happening, and a lot of people came out of that scene and became very successful. I mentioned Joy Division, New Order, Ian Brown, Mick Hucknall. They all. Ian Brown lived next door to me, and would occasionally feed my cat. And a number of people emerged from that scene, from that moment, as is the way with underground scenes like that.
And it's interesting because there's a sort of a resistance there, if that makes sense. Like this coming from sort of something that wasn't kind of easy and effortless. It's not all kind of Wi-Fi'd up, and yet from that there's a kind of painterly sort of drawing of self. And so it's quite an interesting early, I think there's a kind of real privilege to that moment that maybe doesn't exist as much today.
I think the point about it is that the difference between then and now is that now everything, of course, is published instantly. And in those days, a scene like that was really for the people who are participating. If you went to a club dressed in a certain way on a certain night, then the chances were the only people who would see you were the people who were present, who you may or may not be in touch with 40 years later. But it was done for a small group of people. And none of us thought that we would still be here and, talking about it, and that people would be writing about it 40 years later. I mean, the whole scene was kind of founded on the idea that none of us really had very much of a future at all. So we didn't think that we'd ever end up as being history, and that we'd be talked about now.
Yeah, it'd be a great series of portraits. I love this quote. You say, "Look at me with my Savile Row suits," and then you look at me, a picture of me in 1979. I'm still that radical punk rocker. It's just that the clothes I wear now are suited to the life I'm leading. Just because a person wears classical clothes doesn't mean they're conservative. And so there's this lovely kind of sense of your shell kind of changing, like your hair was like, there's one image, but it all kind of like, again, very kind of Donnie Darko-like. And then it's all kind of formed and kind of, I guess, reshaped itself, but it's kind of all the same. And then this idea that what's inside of you, it's formed and still there as an essence. Just as far as the idea of identity and design of self, how that shifted, it would make a very interesting. See, there's your Ian Curtis.
There's Ian Curtis, and there's the Crescent in Hume where I lived. In fact, no, I mean the person who we have to thank for this focus on identity and image, which is it was his greatest gift to our generation, was David Bowie. I mean, he taught us how to adapt our image to our circumstance and who we wanted to be at that particular time. So he was our great master.
Yeah. So let's talk about pattern line and cutting and shape. There was something amazing. I was sent the film, I think it was an exhibition about Max Mara recently, well, not in COVID, but pre. And you were so passionate about just describing the line of the lapel, the shape and form of that. But yet it wasn't just about the line of the pattern, it was about the line of the material, the way then the body relates to that, and even the way I think you describe when a woman ties the belt and forms it. And so there's something, there's a sort of real depth of experience that obviously kind of forms through architecture, maybe through your eyeliners, all the way through. Yeah, just talk about that kind of growth in your knowledge.
That kind of finesse, you're talking about the sort of perfect balance of cut and construction, proportion, harmony, finish, and a kind of quasi-architectural approach, which is how I approached coats. I mean, that comes from a variety of influences that certainly went present when I was in Manchester and in the club days. They kind of came to they culminated at my time in the RCA, but they come from, that short time I spent studying architecture, from the contact that I had with Ozzie Clark, who I think we're going to talk about this evening, who was my tutor at Manchester and the one that persuaded me to come to the Royal College. And from the Royal College itself, but also from the fact that when I came to the Royal College, I was also working as a Saturday boy at Brown's in South Morton Street. And that's another way in which I came to appreciate beautiful clothes. So the Royal College was the place where I developed and honed all those skills and that appreciation of harmony and perfection, and learned in a way under the aegis of my tutor there, Anne Tyrrell, to whom I have to pay tribute, who's sadly now not with us, but a senior tutor. She really took me, this raw boy from Manchester, she really took me under her wing and helped me to appreciate the finer points of clothing and bring out this architectural approach, which is what I have now. And it's largely due to her that I think that I won that competition.
Wow, that's an amazing acknowledgement. Anne is an incredible lady, and has, just to note, she left money that has supported some amazing students in the last 5 years. So yeah, just a little shout out to Anne would be really great there. Yeah, I think it's interesting listening to you talk about being in Browns and then being in the club scene and then being in this kind of art-surrounded kind of studio. It's very much about being surrounded by these elements that you observe, but it's very real, actually. And I think about you coming from that architectural background and the way that you've absorbed all of that. Just as an architect kind of lover or coming from that space, is there a favorite? I mean, it's interesting, like the idea of the coat being like the house. Like, is there a favorite house that you love that we would see is kind of been part of your creative journey too?
Well, my favorite house has to be my own house.
Ah,
of course, where I spend very little time. But it's ironic that, as an architecturally based designer and always arguing for order and a rational approach in the things that I design. Our own home, well, we have one in London, which is quite rational and ordered. But the cottage in Suffolk is totally higgledy-piggledy and is not at all what I would have imagined myself living in. So it just goes to show you always have to allow yourself to digress from your own principles.
I was going to talk about Ozzy later, but I think as you brought him up, we should talk about him now, because in a way, I think the question I asked, like, that's kind of phenomenal. And Ozzy, sort of known, I mean, obviously I didn't know him, but he hung out with the Stones and he kind of lived on that edge. I just wonder did you feel that from him?
Yes. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it was a very personal relationship. I mean, Ozzy was a person who was very open and sincere about himself and where he was coming from. And he'd never taught before, and he never taught after that either. And it was quite a low point in his life when he'd been bankrupted and he had various problems, but he decided that he would like to teach, and he chose Manchester because that's where he came from. That's why he was called Ozzy, Oswald Twistle. And he would come up once a week. And I have to say, most of my fellow students were not that interested in what he had to say, but that gave me the opportunity to have him 100% once a week. And that set me off on the road.
So he was. Do you think he was a good teacher? Like, what stays with you? Like, I think when is that thing that those kind of early years of our learning, there's this sort of very, I think Bart calls it that punctum that kind of stays with us. It sort of punches us. Is there any kind of...
Yes, I think, a good teacher partly forms you as a person. They don't just impart knowledge or help you to learn, but they actually change your personality or change the way you behave, at least. And Ozzy was the one who got me to start thinking about what we now do at Max Mara, which is real clothes for real people. In a slightly old-fashioned way, he used to give me projects where, and this was in the 1980s at an art school where projects tended to be very open-ended and creative. He would give me a list of 20 fabrics and say, design a dress, and it would have to be a dress in each of these fabrics, thinking about how it works, where the grain is, how it works on the bias, what the fabric will do and what it won't do. And so you would have to reflect and think about how a georgette would differ from a chiffon and how that would differ from a silk satin. And that was tremendously useful. And then he would ask us or me to design for women of different body shapes. And so he would say, and it again, sounds incredibly old fashioned, but it was so useful, a woman with very long legs and very wide shoulders, or a large bust and a very long neck. So you'd start to think about what would work on a real person rather than something that was simply a kind of fantasy. So I owe him an awful lot. And he would also, he would come along and he would bring work that he was doing, like he would bring a corset that he was making for Jerry Hall, and he would unfold all the pieces and lay them out on the pattern cutting table. and talk about them. And he would describe how if the pattern was working without even having to sew it together, you can tell by the shape of the pattern pieces that they're happy, and the garment will work. Whereas if they're ugly, the garment will be ugly. And that all fed into my the development of my kind of appreciation of the harmony and the simplicity of a beautifully finished garment.
So let's move to back to the New Romantics, where boys were girls, girls were boys. It all kind of collapsed and collided. And yet at the same time, you say quite clearly you will never do menswear for Max Mara. Yeah. And I wondered whether maybe you've done this, and it'd be lovely to hear whether you've ever dressed men in the women's wear of Max Mara, presented it in that way, and whether you wear the women's wear.
I don't wear the women's wear because it wouldn't fit me. But I do.
Nice big camel coat on your. I don't know.
I do have lots of things that I have made by my tailor in London that are made from Max Mara fabrics. And so you could say that if there was such a thing as Max Mara for men, it would be what I wear. To answer the question about will Max Mara or would Max Mara ever do menswear, you have to go right back to the origins of the company, where Achille Maramotti decided to give something to women that men took for granted, which was well-fitted, tailored clothing. Thinking about, he predicted that women would be entering the workplace and that they would need clothes that were credible for them to work in a uniform. And over a course of 20 or 30 years, Max Mara was one of the companies that developed what became to be known as power dressing. And that was, if you like, a gift to women, that empowered women. Max Mara has been on a 70-year journey with the women who wear it. We mentioned the rise and rise of the Max Mara woman. On that journey, Max Mara appropriated, some menswear icons like the camel coat, which was associated with, male authority and male power. And we now own the camel coat, because the first thing you think of when you see one is Max Mara, and we see men wearing Max Mara coats. So the whole thing's come full circle, and we're happy to see that. But it would be a kind of betrayal of the contract that we have with the women who've always worn that Max Mara, to give that to adapt that for men as well. And perfect as well as I do that that when it comes to tailoring, it's all about fit. It's very difficult to make something tailored fit a man and a woman equally. I mean, some men are lucky that they can wear a Max Mara coat, but if I wore one, the sleeves would be too short, the shoulders would be in the wrong place. I mean, I've got a teddy bear coat, but it's been made for me. I have actually, to answer your question, had recent experience of cutting Max Mara clothes for men, because we've been working with a ballet company here in Italy, and that will be released. That project will be released.
You're sneaking it out there, you see.
So we have done it, and we'll be showing that. Obviously, I think people will take great note of the fact that there are male dancers wearing Max Mara coats, and I expect there'll be discussion about that. But for the time being, there are no plans to market those as commercial products.
Well, hold that space. But I mean, I have to say, I would love to talk about dance, men, women, and coats, but that's another interview. I want to just also touch on your fantastic support around female artists, the Max Mara Award. I think that was such a great generosity and a consistent generosity. I just wonder whether you would talk about some of the partnering that you've had with the artists, whether you've been to their studios, what that's been like to work with them. And I think I'm kind of interested to know, what is the difference that you feel when you hear an artist talk about their work compared to a designer talk about their work?
Well, the Max Mara Art Prize for Women is another aspect of Max Mara's support for women and their empowerment, along with, of course, women in film. It's part of that bond between Max Mara and women. I'm not a judge of the Max Mara Art Prize. I never have been. It's a biennial award that's run in conjunction with the Whitechapel Art Gallery in London, and the award is given to a UK-based woman artist who hasn't yet had a major exhibition, but it's identified some real talent in the past. And of course, the current winner is Emma Talbot, who's an RCA graduate, and we're really looking forward to seeing what she's going to produce. I live in an environment where art is part of what we do, and of course the Art Prize enables us to have contact with those artists and to get to see their work close up and to understand it. And I have actually on many occasions been inspired by their work. In fact, the collection that's in the stores right now is inspired by the work of Corinne Swan, who won the prize 4 or 5 years ago with a project inspired by the Commedia dell'arte. And when I was looking for a way of interpreting the Italian Renaissance for the current summer collection, Corinne Swan's very graphic costumes, the ones she did for her installation and performance, had a very, very modern graphic feeling to them, a bit like a kind of a modern take on the Page Boy. And I had discussions with her and used her work as a jumping off point for how to interpret that Renaissance theme in a way that would feel modern. And at the moment, I'm talking with Laura Provost, who was the first of the Max Mara Art Prize winners, about a project related to our 70th anniversary, which will be, again, released later this year. So,
you need to do a book.
Constant conversations.
You need to do a book of all the conversations you've had, like your memories of conversations with Ozzy, your memories with Ian Brown feeding your cat, all the way up to these amazing artists and more. So I'm just going to ask you one last thing, and then we're going to go to the students' questions. We're going to bring them on. Okay, Paul makes it clear you've done like 2 things. You went to the RCA and you went to Max Mara. So my last question is, if we lived in a world where you had to do 3 things, what would the third be?
I've thought about this, and people ask me, and I can't lie. My favorite hashtag is I love my job, and I do. And because of this job, I've got to go to some incredible places and see some incredible things and talk to some incredible people. I wanted to do a collection inspired by Felix and Irina Yusupov, the prince and princess who lived in St. Petersburg. I discovered that their balls and parties were the talk of St. Petersburg. I got to go to the Hermitage to find those costumes in their archive. I've been so privileged to have access to these wonderful things that, I want to continue doing what I do. I've said in the past, and it's true, that I regard the kind of Max Mara story as well, a narrative, and that each collection is a chapter in that narrative. And it almost feels at times like I'm not writing it, it's almost writing itself. I'm always just uncovering it, and I want to find out what happens next, or what happens.
I think you should do a book about your conversations from Ian Brown onwards. That's my take. Anyhow, I think we should bring on Degas. This is a lady who's on MRes. Well, she was on MRes alumni in 2019. She's a pioneering British painter of auras, writer, researcher, curator, and founder of the genre Contemporary Visionary. Her paintings are a visual description of consciousness. She sees consciousness around people and things. She calls this energy conscious aura. Degas, would you like to ask Ian your question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Firstly, to say I love your Max Mara collection. I'm definitely buying. It's really good. And my question is, how can fine arts be reignited and not discarded as is currently happening?
Right. Well, yes, that's a tough one. I mean, we've talked a little about those Manchester days, and it strikes me that, I came out of a time that was just as hard, possibly, even a little bit harder in terms of bonding for the arts and an environment for the arts. And I think you just can't stop it happening. Culture will happen. You can't hold it down. In a way, part of me is tempted to say, the more you try and stop it, the more it will emerge. But that sort of looks like an argument that falling into the wrong hands, justifies, cutting arts funding on the premise that it will have positive benefits. But I think you just can't stop it. I mean, it's tough on those who are practicing, and they have my every sympathy. But artists will keep on producing art in any circumstance.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you, Digor. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Great.
Thank you.
Our next question is Margot Drayson. She's a history of design currently studying. She is background in art history, and exhibition curation. And when not writing, Margot dreams of costume and fashion design. She practices her sewing techniques occasionally and finds inspiration in films. Hopefully she's going to pop up. She popped up and dropped off again. Margot.
Thank you so much for the talk. So my question was, how may one without a background or training in fashion design, clothing wear, achieve the job you do? So basically follow your successful leads or reach such a role in the industry. Well,
that's how I started. And I think, I was self-taught. My first exposure to designing clothes was with my mother, who's just popped up on one of those slides. We used to go to a department store in Sheffield, near where I grew up, and I used to help her choose patterns and the fabrics to make them in. And I would make suggestions of, make it shorter, make it longer. Why don't you try it in this color or that color, or join those two together to make something else? And I used to watch her cutting the clothes and putting them together, and that taught me an incredible lot. And then in the Manchester days, I not only made those clothes for myself, but I used to make them for other people as well, and sold them to them without having formally learned about pattern cutting or design. It's not brain surgery. Clothes are all around us. You can see them, rather as opposed to brains, which are hidden in people's heads, and you can work out an incredible amount for yourself if you have that kind of instinct. And particularly, if you've done design history, you've thought about design for a number of years. There's no reason why, if you have that sensibility, you couldn't become a designer. You haven't had the luxury of practicing that. Oh, maybe you have. Maybe do you make clothes for yourself or people around you?
A bit. I do. It stays quite, I want to say, like an intimate thing I do for one or two people and for myself. But I think my background's, there's definitely some influence also from arts and from other practices as well. Yeah.
I think maybe you need to go out night clubbing.
Yeah.
What Ian did. It's all about not worrying what it's finished like to begin with. It's all about the spirit of doing it out there with a lot of makeup. It seems to be a very good recipe for success for many, many good designers, I have to say. Mm-hmm. So Margot, thank you so much. Really great that you joined us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Lucinda Abell. She's alumni from 2010, Printed Textiles. She's a textiles artist, associate lecturer at MMU, and runs her, and this is where I got it wrong actually earlier, I was reading this, she runs her own PT studio specializing in glutes. For a minute I thought she was talking about biomaterial, but she's talking about our bottoms. She is pursuing a PhD combining sustainable fashion design and muscular performance. She also represents the Science Council on their EDI steering groups. Lucinda, it's really great to have you. Just need to, off mute, if you would like to ask Ian your question.
Hi, Ian. Lovely to meet you.
And to meet you too, yes.
How would you advise those from underprivileged backgrounds who cannot work for free how to be able to get a foot in the door of a luxury fashion company?
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. You have just to clarify your situation. You're lecturing at Manchester Metropolitan University, which is where I came from, by the way, originally, and you're doing a PhD at the Royal College.
No, I did my master's degree in printed textiles at the Royal College of Art,
right.
And then I'm actually doing a master's degree in physiology and sport and exercise science.
Yes.
So the glutes come
Looking
in.
out next year to combine them into a PhD.
I mean, you have a platform. You have a degree from the most prestigious art and design school in the world, the Royal College. That is a great platform from which to start. People are interested in what you say and what you do. It's a question of how you approach them, and that's a question of sending work off and so on, but tailoring your portfolio to the kind of reality you'd like to work in. That is to say, the kind of brand you'd like to work with, or the kind of company you'd like to. I mean, have you got a clear idea of who, rather than a generic luxury brand, without naming any names, of course?
Yes, there are several I feel my work aligns with, but I'm speaking for not just myself. I work a lot in inclusion and diversity because I struggle, so I want to help others. And a lot of the barriers have come from, you've only done 2 work internships. You need to do more free work internships.
Yes, that's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, the whole internship thing is, in a way, it's a double-edged sword, because young people can't afford to do serial internships year after year, and so that was a problem for them. But now there's legislation that says that companies can't continue to take people on internships, so it's restricted anyway, even if you could afford to support yourself for 2 or 3 years in that way. I mean, I can talk on Max Mara's behalf and say that we don't do unpaid internships. And when we recruit somebody from college or from where they happen to be after college, it's on the understanding, or at least the intention, that they will stay with us for years, if not for the best part of their career. We look to build relationships with people.
I wonder also, Ian, whether, I'm sorry to keep coming back to nightclubs, but I wonder whether, for me, I think it is about kind of building your own communities too. And actually, I think it's important to kind of not just, the luxury houses are going to be there forever, but they also need to be challenged with what comes through new. And I think we're maybe at a time when it's important to build communities yourselves where you can grow and learn together. And then that kind of begins to put a voice out there that might help.
Yes,
I think it is hard, and they shouldn't have to.
That's a very good point, Zoe. I think that thinking about the concept of luxury, what do you really mean when you say, a luxury house or a luxury brand? It's a word that we use too frequently, and I've been thinking about it. And in terms of Max Mara, I thought, what's luxury? Is it not something that's unnecessary and expensive? in which case does that apply to Max Mara? Because Max Mara is about a wardrobe that you wear that equips you for the life that you have to lead, particularly your working life, but also your social life. It's actually useful clothing. So therefore, Max Mara is not luxury, it's a utility item. And so I think that anyone wanting to go into that market has to have a very, very clear idea of what that market is. And if any particular brand that they're approaching, they have to show that they really understand what that brand is to them, and possibly help that brand give a new interpretation, something that they hadn't thought of. But I acknowledge how difficult it is to make that first step when everything's dominated by internships generally.
So thank you, Lucinda. I mean, I think it's really positive what you're doing, and I think it's a really key question to ask. And yeah, we don't have answers, but we will have to start thinking and work on that much more as we go forward. Lorenzo Piazza, you might get an Italian. I can't translate. Lorenzo's actually studied product design in Bologna, and then he went to the RCA where he did his graduate diploma, and then he joined the experimental design pathway for IED, Information Experience Design Masters. He's passionate about projects built around the elements of surprise, magic, and cultural heritage. Lorenzo, feel free to talk in Italian. I'll just take a back seat.
Should I ask you in Italian?
Yeah, go ahead.
You can if you want, but nobody else will understand, but I will.
Ok.
Yeah, but it'd be nice.
Allora, mi chiedevo quale fosse il panorama di opportunità per un designer di esperienze nell'industria della moda, possibilmente italiana.
Allora, Lorenzo asked, what are the possibilities, the kind of landscape of possibilities for a designer with experience in Italy? Vero? Traduzione giusto, no?
Sì, per un designer di esperienze, perché...
There are opportunities, of course. We've been through a difficult time. What's going to happen next? The employment market has been a bit tough over the past year. At the very most, companies haven't been taking on new designers and creative people. Some have been laying them off. But what's going to happen next? Is there going to be a kind of boom, a new explosion? We hope so. But in any case, whatever the climate is, it's a question of how you address yourself. I think you have to look at the Italian scene, identify where it is that you want to go, rather than approach it in a kind of generic kind of way. What I look for in somebody who comes to me is a portfolio or work which I can see relates to what we do, not necessarily a kind of aping what we do already. That's not so useful, but something that shows me a new direction, a spark of something maybe that we haven't thought of, but definitely some kind of link with our world. So I think you have to look at the Italian landscape and decide where it is that you'd feel most comfortable, and pursue that doggedly.
So thank you so much, Lorenzo. I love you in your black and white, joining me
Yes.
in your very Fellini-esque kind of look. So thank you for joining us this evening. Really great.
Thank you.
Our next question is actually from a gentleman called Christopher McCarthy. He's an RCA supporter, but he's not able to join us. So I'm going to ask the question on behalf of him. And he says, how do you manage to make your coats the must-have item of the season every single year?
Yeah. Well, it's not all down to design. There is the important factor of fabrics. Max Mara uses the very best fabrics, which are the ones that will last and wear for years and years and years. And it's knowing how to choose those fabrics, identify the best ones, and work with, in many cases, with the mills that make them to develop qualities of fabric which are exclusive to us. Then it's about having a factory which knows how to handle those fabrics. I'd love to take you on a tour of our coat factory here in San Maurizio in Reggio Emilia, where I'm sitting today at our head office, where a way of making coats has been evolved, which is unparalleled anywhere else. And just to give you sort of a few small examples, when the fabric's been cut out for the coat to be assembled, it's left to rest for a few days so that it can breathe. It's treated with that degree of respect. And then when the coat starts to be assembled on the kind of assembly line, the shoulder seams are sewn first. It goes onto a hanger, and from that point on, the coat isn't removed from the hanger at any stage, so that it doesn't get battered and beaten in the manufacturing process. So that when it gets to the pressing stage, it hardly requires any pressing. So that coat starts life as an impeccable piece of tailoring.
Can you go back to the breathing? That's beautiful. So it's cut out and then it has
to rest.
It's left flat though.
It's left to rest.
So it's almost like kind of when it's cut from the frame of the weave, it's like it breathes out a little bit. Is that what you're saying?
It rests. And these are all things that have been discovered over the years. So those are a good starting point for obtaining that kind of quality. From a design point of view, we've talked about influences and so on, and we've talked about an architectural approach. I think that when it comes to a coat particularly, it requires what I think is the most difficult thing for a designer to acquire, and it shows great maturity as a designer, is the ability to design yourself out of that garment, because a coat has to be pure and harmonious. It's something with which the person who buys it and wears it is going to develop an emotional relationship. It's about that person and their relationship with that coat. It's not about you making a statement. So it's the maturity and the sophistication as a designer to step back, to design away, to strip away, to pare it back to the essentials, the basic harmony, and cover that and leave it behind. And I always think, that's the ultimate lesson that a designer can learn is to leave themselves out. After all that inspiration, and Debussy and Margaret Atwood and Marilyn Monroe and
a bit of Dostoevsky,
and bit of Dostoevsky, then to sort of step back and.
But I need to get some tents in your factory so our students could come and stay there for 2 or 3 months, because I think it's about being in that space. Like, I know that you're in the design office or your office right now, but and so it's very close to the factory, and so it feels that's a bit like everything we've talked about. You being in the nightclubs in Manchester, around the people, the makeup. It's about being with Ozzy and surrounded by the art as you came to Max Mara at an early stage. But again, it feels to me that knowledge that you've just described so beautifully is something maybe we need to think about in education, that there's an important place for it. But there is a part where to do almost like a sleepover in the factory might not be such a bad thing.
You'd be very welcome to visit us here.
Yeah.
I'm in our head office now, and this is my office, and what you see in the background is the new summer collection that we've been working on today. This office is like a kind of space where I incubate new collections until they're old enough to stand up on their own. So it's at a tender stage at the moment. And only a few miles away is that factory that I was talking about. It's all based here in Reggio Emilia. I'm sure there's a reason, incidentally, why Max Mara happened where it did geographically, because this is the area where they make Parmesan cheese and Ducatis. In this area, craftspeople are devoted to making things beautifully, but making them consistently. And that's the difference between the Italian fashion industry and Paris couture, say, which is about making one beautiful thing that can't be repeated. Max Mara and Italian fashion is about, on an industrial scale, not just making one beautiful coat, but making 2,000 of them.
Wow, that's I love it. Parmesan, Ducati, and a camel Max Mara coat. I can't think of anything better. Maybe a little bit of honey with your Parmesan. So you have one last very special guest, Francesca Amphitrioff. It's a beautiful name, tricky to say. She's alumni from the RCA, but she was also on our council. She's part of the American kind of support team, and she's come with us today. So, Francesca, thank you so much for coming through. I'll leave you to ask the question to Ian.
Hello, Francesca.
Hi, Ian. So wonderful to be here. Zoe, thank you so much. Ian, I loved all the images that you showed us. So fabulous. And I wanted to ask you two quick questions. I'm going to kind of merge them together. And one is, obviously, we've talked a lot about the coat, but is there a connection that you believe between your time, as a punk and that era and the coat? And that's very much to do with proportions and lengths, because there's something that the coat has always kind of, there's a reference definitely there. And I'm just wondering if in your work you've seen that reference and felt that reference. And the other is really with architecture and color, and your use of color in a very particular way, and if that's linked to architecture.
Well, when it comes to the coat, I can think of coats that I bought, secondhand ones that I would wear over those club looks. And the coat is the connection between then and now, if you like. And it's that thing that can be interpreted by anyone from Susie Sue to Marilyn Monroe, if you like, in terms of their personality. It's what I was saying about the coat being not just for one woman or one wearer, but for 2,000 women or 2,000 wearers, as Isabella Rossellini wearing the first coat that I ever designed for Max Mara. If I think about what I had then and what I do now, the coat is a continuous fil rouge that runs through everything that I've done. And so, yes, it is the connection between me now and me then. In terms of colour, the Max Mara is famous for camel. I think in camel. I've said that I dream in camel. My world is camel. It's the colour that I instinctively choose every time. But at the same time, I make a real effort with every collection to come up with new colours like pastels or brights or something, and as a foil to that. And sometimes the inspiration is architectural, and sometimes it's not. But I think it's really important to push the boundaries a little bit. And whilst we always develop that camel universe, to try other things too, and it's also amusing for me to try something new. There's Nancy Pelosi, by the way, in her paprika plain red coat, and that's a really good example because it's not a camel coat; it's a particular shade of red, and that's the coat she wore when she met Donald Trump at the White House, and she emerged victorious from their meeting. And I'm quite sure that she wore that Max Mara coat. It wasn't a new coat; she'd had it for 7 or 8 years at the time. And I think she wore it because she has an emotional relationship with it and she loves it, but also because it made a statement in its colour about setting the White House alight. And that's what everyone said about the coat on that occasion. And it came to be known as the flame coat. So, that's a really good example of how to use colour.
Amazing.
Fantastic.
I think, did you have another question, Francesca? Are you okay?
Well, no, I'm okay. I'm great. Thank you so much.
So I'm going to say, Ian, we probably will bring on Paul as we just come to an end, which is like it seems to have gone in 2 seconds. I just had to quickly look up because when you said Ducati, it made me immediately think of the Tamara Lampica in camel in her green Ducati.
Yes.
But yeah, so from this kind of almost like the Nijinsky nymph, that's what you look like on the image of you back in the back in the 80s in Manchester. You've taken us from this Nijinsky nymph-esque kind of Donnie Darko-esque amazing story of those early days, all the way through Ozzie Clarke and, of course, the Royal, and right up to this sort of industrial excellence, this sort of DNA of Italy that sort of is what Max Mara also is part of. And so it's been an amazing, amazing time listening to you talk. Thank you so much. I will think of Ducati, Parmesan and camel coats always together in the future.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you for allowing me to share a bit of my story and give credit to the Royal College, which is the place where it all happened for me.
Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you, Zoe, as well. Thank you. We're very proud of you. I think what you've achieved is absolutely extraordinary in terms of consistency, longevity, and quality. And it was wonderful hearing you talk so openly. Wonderful to see your images of Eileen Gray and Eileen Gray furniture. Great choices there. Thank you very much indeed to all of the students and all of the participants who've made this evening so pleasurable, fantastic, and lovely also to think about Anne Tyrrell. I completely agree with both you and Zoe. I mean, really, really special woman. I was lucky to overlap with her for a few years at the RCA and always enjoyed my conversations with her. I think she's a very, very special person. But thank you very much, Ian, indeed, and we hope to see you in London in real life. Thanks very much. Bye then.
Thank you, Ian.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, Zoe.
Brava.